Maryland, 1801. The Fugitive Slave Act had just been passed, turning every white person in America into a potential bounty hunter, legally authorized to capture and return escaped slaves for profit. But in the misty forests along the Potomac River, something far more sinister than legal slave catching was happening. A woman who called herself Kate Bender had turned hunting human beings into a blood sport, and what she did to the freedom seekers who crossed her path will chill you to your very soul. Her name was whispered in terror throughout the Underground Railroad network, but here's what they don't want you to know. This wasn't just about money or legal bounties. This was about a woman who had discovered that the ultimate power came from holding life and death in her hands, and the screams that echoed through the Maryland wilderness would haunt the region for generations. Welcome back to Buried Truths, where we uncover the stories they buried and give voice to those they silenced. I'm about to take you deep into one of the most terrifying hunting operations in American history, and trust me, you've never heard evil described like this before. What you're about to witness will shock you. So if you're ready to face the brutal reality of how one woman turned human hunting into her personal entertainment, then buckle up, because Kate Bender's story is about to destroy your faith in humanity. But before we dive into this blood-soaked tale of systematic murder, let me ask you something that will haunt you by the end of this video. What kind of person looks at another human being's desperate flight to freedom and sees it as an opportunity for sport? Hold on to that question, because by the time I'm done telling you Kate Bender's story, you'll understand how evil can transform hunting animals into hunting people without missing a heartbeat. The year 1801 found America's capital region buzzing with the recent passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, a law that made every escaped slave fair game for anyone willing to capture them. The $10 bounty for each returned slave had created an entire industry of professional slave catchers, men who tracked human beings like animals and delivered them back to bondage for profit. But along the densely forested border between Maryland and Virginia, where the Potomac River created natural hiding places for freedom seekers, the hunting had taken on a much darker purpose. Kate didn't see these desperate souls as human beings deserving of help. She saw them as prey. She saw them as entertainment. She saw them as opportunities to indulge in the darkest impulses of the human heart without fear of legal consequences. The operation was horrifyingly simple and absolutely terrifying in its calculated cruelty. Fleeing slaves would arrive seeking help, and Kate would welcome them with apparent kindness, offering food, water, and promises of safe passage. She would encourage them to rest, to sleep, to let their guard down completely. Then, when they were at their most vulnerable, she would reveal her true nature. Now, I need you to understand something crucial here that makes this story even more disturbing than simple murder. Kate Bender wasn't killing for money, though she would sometimes collect bounties on the bodies she produced. She wasn't killing out of racial hatred, though that certainly played a role. She was killing because she had discovered that the act of hunting human beings gave her a sense of power and control that nothing else in her miserable life could provide. Her victims weren't just individuals. They were entire families who had pooled their courage and resources for one desperate attempt at freedom. Picture a father carrying his youngest child, a mother leading her teenage daughters, grandparents who had decided they would rather die free than live enslaved. All of them walking into Kate Bender's web of deception, thinking they had found help when they had actually found their executioner. The cabin became a chamber of horrors where Kate would play with her victims like a cat plays with mice. She would tie them up, separate families so they could watch each other suffer, and then begin what she called her games. These weren't quick, merciful deaths. They were prolonged torture sessions where Kate would experiment with different methods of causing pain and terror. But here's what makes this even more chilling. She kept trophies. Personal items from her victims, pieces of clothing, sometimes even body parts that she would preserve as mementos of her kills. The cabin was decorated with these ghastly souvenirs, creating a museum of murder that would have horrified even hardened soldiers. Around 1803, her operation expanded when she began working with a network of like-minded individuals who shared her appetite for human hunting. These weren't professional slave catchers working within the legal system. These were sadists who had found each other and decided to turn the Maryland wilderness into their personal hunting preserve. Now, the group would set traps along known underground railroad routes, creating false safe houses and fake conductors who would guide fleeing slaves directly into their hands. They developed increasingly sophisticated methods of luring victims, sometimes spending weeks establishing their credibility within the Freedom Network before springing their deadly traps. Local folklore from the region speaks of nights when the forest would echo with screams that didn't sound quite human, carried on the wind like the cries of tortured spirits. But these weren't supernatural phenomena. They were the sounds of real people dying horrible deaths at the hands of predators who had abandoned every trace of human decency. The systematic nature of Kate's evil was breathtaking in its organization. She kept detailed journals of her kills, noting the dates, methods, and personal details of each victim like a hunter recording trophy animals. She rated her victims based on how long they survived her torture, how loudly they screamed, how much they begged for mercy. The murders escalated in both frequency and brutality as Kate's appetite for killing grew stronger. What had started as occasional opportunistic killings became a regular schedule of systematic slaughter. She would hunt multiple times per week during peak travel seasons, sometimes killing entire families in single nights of concentrated horror. But here's the part of the story that will absolutely destroy your faith in humanity. Kate Bender operated this nightmare for over a decade without serious interference from law enforcement. The legal system that was supposed to protect all citizens simply didn't recognize escaped slaves as deserving of protection. Their disappearances were often attributed to natural hazards or recapture by legal slave catchers. The beginning of the end came around 1815, when changing political conditions made her operation more visible to authorities. The War of 1812 had brought increased military presence to the region, and stories of mass disappearances in the Maryland wilderness began to attract unwanted attention from federal investigators. Her downfall came not from her crimes against escaped slaves, but from a crucial mistake. She killed a free black family who had been traveling with proper documentation. Unlike her previous victims, these were legally free citizens whose disappearance triggered a serious investigation that couldn't be ignored or explained away. Now, I want you to imagine the absolute horror of the crime scene when authorities finally raided Kate Bender's cabin in 1816. They found human remains scattered throughout the property, personal belongings from dozens of victims, and journals detailing years of systematic torture and murder. The woman who had posed as a helper to desperate freedom seekers was revealed to be one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. During her capture and the investigation that followed, authorities began uncovering evidence of crimes that stretched back over 15 years. They found mass graves in the surrounding forest. They discovered torture devices that Kate had crafted specifically for her human prey. They uncovered correspondence with other members of her killing network. But here's what makes this story even more devastating. The full extent of Kate Bender's crimes will never be known. How many freedom seekers disappeared into her forest, never to be seen again? How many families were destroyed by her sadistic games? How many children were tortured to death by a woman they thought would save them? Conservative estimates suggest she was responsible for the murders of over 200 people, but the real number could be much higher. The impact on the Underground Railroad was immediate and catastrophic. Routes that had operated successfully for years were abandoned overnight. Safe houses throughout the region were questioned and investigated. The entire Freedom Network had to be rebuilt with new protocols designed to prevent another Kate Bender from infiltrating their operations. Her trial, when it finally began in 1817, drew crowds from across the region who came to see the woman who had terrorized their communities for so long. The evidence presented was so horrific that several jury members became physically ill during testimony. Witnesses described scenes of torture and murder that challenged the very limits of human comprehension. Kate Bender showed no remorse during her trial, no recognition that she had done anything wrong. When asked why she had killed innocent people seeking freedom, her response chilled everyone in the courtroom. "They weren't people to me. They weren't people to me. They were just animals, and hunting animals is what I do best." On September 23, 1817, Kate Bender was hanged in public execution that drew thousands of spectators. But even in death, she continued to terrorize the community. Local legends spoke of her ghost still hunting in the Maryland forests, still seeking escaped slaves to torture and kill for eternity. The psychological impact on the black community was even more profound than the immediate physical damage. Every white person offering help became suspect. Every safe house became a potential death trap. Every act of kindness became a possible setup for torture and murder. The paranoia was so intense that many freedom seekers chose to avoid the Underground Railroad entirely. More importantly, Kate Bender's crimes revealed a horrific truth that many wanted to ignore: that the dehumanization inherent in slavery created conditions where such monsters could thrive. In a society where black lives were considered property rather than human existence, predators like Kate could operate with virtual impunity. But let me tell you something that most history books won't. Kate Bender wasn't unique. She was just the most systematic and most sadistic of numerous predators who used the legal framework of slavery to indulge their murderous impulses. The Underground Railroad had to constantly evolve to stay ahead of such human hunters. Think about this. For over 15 years, the most dangerous threat to escaped slaves in Maryland wasn't legal slave catchers or plantation overseers. It was a woman who had turned human hunting into her personal entertainment. For over 15 years, hope itself had been weaponized against the most vulnerable people in American society. Now, I'm not here to tell you how to process Kate Bender's evil. That's not my job, and it's not the point of this channel. What I'm here to tell you is the truth that they tried to bury. That slavery created conditions where the most twisted aspects of human nature could flourish unchecked, and that the most vulnerable people in society often become prey for those who have abandoned all moral constraints. Kate Bender believed she could torture and murder human beings without consequence because the legal system had already declared her victims to be less than human. Whether you see her as a product of her time or as a monster who transcended all historical context, what you cannot deny is that her crimes were enabled by a society that had normalized the dehumanization of an entire race. The escaped slaves who trusted Kate Bender didn't see her as a predator or a killer. They saw her as salvation, as their chance at freedom, as someone who cared enough to risk helping them. They believed, as desperate people often do, that kindness existed in the world and that someone would help them reach safety. Instead, they found someone who saw their desperation as entertainment and their trust as weakness. Today, nearly 200 years later, we still struggle with the legacy of predators like Kate Bender. How do we protect the vulnerable without discouraging legitimate help? How do we identify monsters who wear the masks of saviors? How do we prevent systems of oppression from creating the conditions where such evil can flourish? What we can say with certainty is that Kate Bender's crimes were a direct result of a society that had commodified human beings and created legal frameworks that enabled their systematic abuse. She operated within a system that made her crimes profitable and provided her with ready victims who had no legal protection. The blood that soaked the Maryland forests in the early 1800s was the blood of hope destroyed, of trust betrayed, of families torn apart by sadistic entertainment, disguised as legal slave catching. It was the blood of people who died believing that freedom was within their grasp, never knowing that their helper was actually their torturer. So the next time someone tells you that slavery wasn't really about evil, that it was just an economic system, remember Kate Bender. Remember the woman who turned human hunting into sport, who weaponized kindness against the desperate, and who proved that when society normalizes the dehumanization of any group, monsters will always emerge to exploit that dehumanization for their own twisted purposes. If this story has moved you, if it's opened your eyes to the buried truths of American history, then I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because this is exactly the kind of story that mainstream history wants to forget. But here at Buried Truths, we're committed to digging up these stories and giving voice to those they tried to silence. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Leave a comment telling me what other buried truths you want me to uncover. And remember, the stories they buried are the ones that matter most, because they're the ones with the power to change how we see the world. Kate Bender's reign of terror lasted over 15 years, but its impact echoes through American history even today. It reminds us that evil often wears a helpful face, that predators thrive when society creates vulnerable populations, and that the most dangerous monsters are often those who exploit systems of oppression for their own sadistic pleasure. The human hunter was swift and terrible, but she was also a creation of a system that had already declared her victims to be less than human. Until next time, keep digging for the truth, because the stories they buried are the ones we need to remember. This is Buried Truths, where we uncover the past to understand the present. The voices they silenced will be heard.